Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene.
State of Michigan, Porcupine Mountains Park. 60,000 acres of wild taiga, where the cry for help is drowned in the sound of the wind, unable to reach the human ear. On August 24, 2014, 46-year-old Catherine Thomas and her 24-year-old daughter Doris set out on a popular hiking trail, never to return. Their disappearance seemed like a tragic accident, another reminder that mountains don't forgive mistakes. 7 months of searching, hoping, and despair only resulted in their names being added to the list of wildlife victims. But the truth behind the disappearance was far more terrifying than a predator attack or a fall off a cliff. When one of the missing was found alive 600 miles away, locked in the trunk of an unmarked car, it seemed like a miracle had happened. But it wasn't a rescue. It was the beginning of a nightmare that turned the detective's perception of who was the victim and who was the executioner. On the 24th day of 2254th Serpentine Rock, the early hours at Porcupine Mountains State Park were deceptively quiet. The dense fog that rose from Lake Superior covered the tops of the hills with a brisk white shroud, muffling the sounds and shaping the trees. The air was drenched with lint and the smell of pine, and the temperature reached 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which was quite cool for the end of summer. It was exactly 8:45 minutes early when a dark blue Jeep Cherokee pulled into the gravel parking lot near the beginning of the escarpment trail. The driver was 46-year-old Catherine Thomas, a woman with a hard look and perfect posture, who worked as a senior accountant for a large company. In the passenger seat sat her 25-year-old daughter, Doris. At first glance, they appeared to be a normal family that had decided to spend the weekend in nature. But casual witnesses who had been in the parking lot nearby later recalled the tension that literally hung in the interior between the women. The checkpoint attendant, a 60-year-old man named James Miller, noted their arrival in the logbook. According to his testimony, Catherine Thomas behaved with confidence and even authority. She checked her daughter's clothes, adjusted the straps of her knapsack, and said something to her in a low voice. Doris, a blonde girl with long, light hair, looked downcast and apathetic. She nodded and looked down at her feet, as if she were doing an important duty, not preparing for a walk along one of the most hired routes in Michigan. At about 1:30 p.m., 15 minutes early, the women took the route. Their destination was the Lake Oblake viewpoint, an iconic spot overlooking the Big Carp River Valley. The escarpment trail is considered difficult. It stretches for 4 miles along a skeletal ridge with steep hills and slimy rocks. But Ketrin and Doris, judging from everything, were well prepared. They were wearing good quality trekking shoes, waterproof jackets, and over their shoulders, medium-sized backpacks with a day's supply of water and food. The last confirmed visual contact with the survivors took place at 14:00 minutes. A friend from Wisconsin, who was coming down from the hovering peak, met the two women on a narrow stretch of stitching. Later, when they testified to the sheriff's deputy, they said that the mother and the daughter had been having a voice conversation about something. The older woman, Ketrin, was holding the younger woman by the neck, her face contorted with anger. When they saw the others, they sweetly winked and gave a courteous chuckle. But in the young woman's eyes, as the witness said, there was an indecipherable fear. It was the last time anyone had ever seen Catherine and Doris Thomas. As the sun began to fall before setting, the shadows in the forest grew lively, turning the trees into sinister silhouettes. By 25 in the evening, the Jeep Cherokee was still parked in the parking lot, self-conscious and covered in evening dew. Robert Thomas, Ketrin's boyfriend, who was staying over in Marquette, began to vilevate. According to the plan, They were going to telephone him no later than 7 o'clock in the evening, return to the car promptly, and catch the signal of the Stilnokovoy network. About 21st year of 35 Violin, Robert made the first call to the service of Poryatunku Viriatunku 111. The reaction of the authorities was negative. About 25 minutes later, an Ontonagon County patrol officer arrived in the parking lot. He confirmed the presence of the vehicle. The car was locked, no evidence of evil. In the middle of the cabin, on the front seat, there was a map of the park with a marked route and 2 empty bottles of kava. The officer looked through the windows but saw nothing to indicate a struggle or a rush. It seemed that the owners had just left for a moment and would return. The search operation was launched on 25 minutes past midnight. The scale of the forces involved was staggering. About 50 volunteers, professional rangers, forensic scientists with dogs, and a U.S. Coast Guard helicopter equipped with a thermal imaging camera. The weather, however, was against the rangers. The low gloom and heavy rain that began to fall made it difficult for the aviation team to operate, and the thick foliage of the trees, the so-called canopy, made the thermal imagers impractical. Ground groups scoured the forest in a lancet, flying at a distance of 10 feet from one to the other. The terrain was inaccessible. Deep holes, gorges under ferns, and slimy, mossy skeletons were a deadly nuisance, even for seasoned searchers. The scouting dogs picked up the trail near the beginning of the trail and led the group along the ridge for about 2 miles. But near the Big Carp River stream, the dogs started to spin and roar. The trail broke near the water's edge, so the women entered the creek and settled in it. The days became days, but the forest did not give up its hired women. The hope of finding them alive vanished with each passing year. The versions of the investigation changed one by one. An unfortunate accident, an attack by a wild animal. They got lost and went into the cliffs of the reserve. However, the absence of any remedies, neither a burnt candy bar nor a beach with water, put even veterans of search and retrieval service in a blind corner. Only on the 10th day of the search, on the 5th day of 2494th year, there was a breakthrough. A group of volunteers, who were searching a deep hole about 5 miles to the east of the official stitch, found an item of clothing. A lightweight stitching scarf with a Kvitkovi print hung on the brush. Robert Thomas recognized the scarf as belonging to his daughter Doris. The note raised more questions than it answered. The scarf was not torn or bruised, as it is when it falls or leaks through the haversack. It was neatly folded and tied on the neck at the level of the eyes, otherwise it was a signal or a mite. There were no broken nails, no traces of blood, no shreds of clothing. The ground was unoccupied and clean, covered only with fallen needles. This marvelous, even mystical detail made the sheriff doubt the theory of a simple accident. If the women fell from the skeleton, how did the scarf end up 5 miles off the trail, neatly tied on the head? Who left this sign? Further searches in the square for the scarf yielded no results. January came, bringing with it the first frosts and crimson streams from Lake Superior. On January 30th, 2214, the active phase of the search was officially suspended. The case of Catherine and Doris Thomas became a cold case. In police reports, the main version remained an accident in an inaccessible area, with the bodies subsequently preserved by natural causes. The Porcupine Mountains forest had swept them away, leaving only silence and a neatly folded scarf on their foreheads as the only proof that this disappearance was not an accident. 7 months of silence had passed. On the 25th day of 2555th year, Detroit, Michigan, greeted the night with a wicked cold and humming wind that walked between the ruins of the former industrial grandeur. The neighborhood near the abandoned Packard plant had long ago been transformed into a municipality. Blocks of empty workshops, broken bumps with trees sprouting through them, and unfinished vacant lots covered with building sludge. It was a place where the police tried not to go unless it was absolutely necessary, and the local inhabitants used to go a tenth of the way. About 1 year and 15 minutes into the night, Patrol Officer James Michaels was visiting his sector. His route took him through the raised building of the former Iron City Motors auto service station. The light from the headlights of the patrol car revealed the silhouette of a car parked in a blind corner behind the service's cellar wall. It was an old gray Ford Taurus sedan, covered with a thick ball of a road saw. The officer immediately noticed that the car is missing license plates, and the rear left tire is completely flat, because the car has been here for more than a year. Michaels pulled the patrol car over, flashed a spotlight, and notified the dispatcher of the suspicious vehicle. Acting in accordance with the theft check protocol, he approached the Ford with his hand on his holster. The wind swirled in the broken windows of the service station, creating a droning cacophony. But as the officer approached the back of the sedan, he felt a sound that caused him to freeze. From the middle of the trunk, there was a faint but rhythmic thumping sound. It was not similar to the sound that could be made by an animal. It was methodical. 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats again. Michaels moved closer to the trunk's crisper and made a vocal yelp, begging to get out of the way. In response, the banging only became more hysterical. The officer realized that there would be no time to wait for fixing. The trunk lock looked damaged, but still held the cricket. Michaels turned back to his car, took out the mount, and jerked it into the gap between the body and the cricket. The metal scraped, leaning on the police officer's forces, but after a minute, the lock gave in with a resounding clang. The trunk crisper went uphill. What was revealed by the change in the Lickstar Officer Michaels would shock even a veteran of the Detroit Homicide Squad who had seen a lot of stings in his age. In the dark space of the trunk, burrowed among old canisters with car mastic, rags, and a spare tire, lay a woman. She was a woman, but her condition was frightening. She had been reduced to a living skeleton. Her temples were sharply protruding from her face, covered with earthy, grayish skin. She wore the remnants of her clothes, which had turned into linen that did not burn, but only covered her nakedness. Her eyes were narrowly covered by a breast garment that served as a tether, and her arms, pressed against her breasts, were bound with crude industrial plastic ties. Officer Michaels promptly called paramedics with a code indicating that the victim had been found in critical condition. While the ambulance was making its way through the broken roads of the industrial zone, the policeman tried to calm the woman, but she did not respond to his words, continuing to tremble in cold and shock. About the 2nd year and 45 minutes later, a medical team arrived at the scene. During the initial examination, they detected critical dehydration, severe hypothermia, and severe atrophy of muscles, which indicated a long-lasting disability. There were many sore spots on her wrists and ankles from the constant wearing of the tracks. It was Catherine Thomas. The woman, who for 7 months was thought to be dead in the forests of Upper Pivostrov, mourned and almost forgotten, was found alive 600 miles from the place of her disappearance. The most terrible thing in this scene was not physical injuries, but the psychological state of the victim. When the paramedics cut the plastic ties and carefully removed the breast ligature from her eyes, Officer Michaels expected a scream, tears, or hysteria. The light of the lictor's glare struck her in the face, causing her eyes to blur. Catherine Thomas clinked her eyes, wincing at the light she thought she had never seen before. Her gaze was blank, devoid of any emotion, but part of her soul remained where it had been for 7 months. She did not ask where she was. She did not ask for water, nor did she call the police. Her parched, torn lips curled, and in the silence of the Detroit night, there was a low, hoarse whisper that Officer Michaels later put word for word in his report. The phrase was not a tribute for the Porcupine. It sounded like a rebuke to myself. I didn't pass the tryout. He took Doris. Friends, before we go into the darkest part of this story, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, put in Potobike this video, and leave any comments. This is a simple action for you, but it is critically important for YouTube algorithms. It is your activity that helps to promote such complex investigations, so that this story can be seen by as many people as possible. Thank you for your kindness and support. Catherine Thomas was taken to the Detroit Recovery Hospital's intensive care unit. The intensive care ward, where the woman was placed, looked more like a regime facility than a hospital room. 2 police officers were stationed near the door, and the access of medical personnel was severely restricted. For the first 40 to 47 years after the attack, Catherine was in a state of acute discomfort. She lay stiffly, staring at the white wall, and did not respond to the questions of the doctors or the detectives. Her consciousness, protecting herself from the fever, switched off the outside world, leaving the woman to wander through the labyrinths of her own memory. Only on the 3rd day, 5th day of June, the patient's condition stabilized to such an extent that the doctors allowed the first drink. Detectives from the Detroit Major Crimes Unit, along with forensic psychologist Dr. Alan Reynolds, came to the room. What they sensed over the next 4 years made even experienced investigators cringe at the cold cruelty of the sensed. Catherine's account sounded not like the chaotic arguments of a victim, but like a detailed script of a sting movie, where every day was a struggle for survival. According to Catherine, the fatal mistake occurred on the afternoon of the 24th of September. She and Doris decided to go off the marked path to shorten the way to the observation maidan. In the middle of the woods, far from the hiking trails, they met a man. He was dressed in a camouflage suit, his face partly covered with darkness from the brim of his cap. The stranger was friendly and offered to show the women an old abandoned copper mine, a local memorial not recognized on maps. However, when they got too far from the main road, the mask of friendliness fell off. The man drew his pistol and, threatening to kill them on the spot, forced them to walk for several years into the woods, where a camouflaged van was waiting for them on the old logging road. Catherine testified that the next 7 months of their lives were spent in total darkness. They were brought to a thought lodge in the middle of nowhere and locked in a soundproof basement. It was a concrete room without windows, where the only source of light was a dark bulb, which only flickered on for a few minutes during the year. The conditions of confinement were unhuman. The women were not given normal food. Once a day, the jailer brought them bowls of cheap canned dog food and plastic water bottles. Catherine never saw her jailer without a mask. He always wore a black balaclava that covered his face and spoke in a changed, muffled voice. He called himself the Judge. His philosophy was a mixture of religious fanaticism and divine inspiration. He constantly reiterated that women were polluted by the sins of the modern world and needed to be purified through suffering and deliverance. Each day in the basement was accompanied by psychological pressure. The Judge forced them to repent of their guilt, lecturing them for years on morality, while the women sat tied up on the cold concrete bed. But the most horrifying part of Catherine's story was the moment of separation. According to her words, exactly a month ago, the robber changed his tactics. He declared that Catherine was hopeless, and her soul was too weak to be repaired, unlike Doris, who, in his opinion, still had a chance for redemption. Catherine described this moment with painful detail. How the judge pulled her out of the cellar. How Doris, crying, clung to her mother's clothes, prayed not to separate them, and vowed to be attentive so that only her mother would be left by her side. The finale of her plea was rapt. Ketrin said that she was injected with an unknown substance, from which she mutely became drowsy. The next thing she remembered was the cold, the darkness of the trunk, the smell of gasoline and the noise of the big city which she heard through the metal walls of the car before the officer found her. Detroit police negatively contacted colleagues in the middle of the state. The description of events ideally contributed to the profile of a serial maniac Samite, who could operate for years in the forests of the Upper Peninsula. The task force began to prepare an oration on the judge and the murder of Doris Thomas. The investigation seemed to have gotten all the answers they needed. But the forensic psychologist, Dr. Reynolds, left the room looking stubborn. As he looked over his notes, he drew the detective's attention to one surprising detail that didn't fit the picture of maternal grief. Ketrin described her daughter's suffering with an unnatural compassion. She remembered every detail: how Doris trembled, how she cried, how she ate dog food so as not to anger the vicrador. She repeated the phrase that Doris suffered for two, taking the punishment for her mother. But there was no spontaneity or pain in her voice. It sounded not like a mother who lost her child, but like an observer's report, which is written by the fact that the disciplinary protocol was well implemented. The psychologist raised his gaze at the detectives and quietly blurted out the words that planted the first grain of doubt in this idealized history of the victim. While the doctors in Detroit fought for the physical and mental recovery of Catherine Thomas, hundreds of miles away from her hospital room, in the sterile silence of a crime lab, another battle was brewing. The battle for evidence of speech. The key to unraveling the mystery was the same old Ford Taurus sedan, in the trunk of which the woman was found. The car was a ghost. The license plates were missing, and the identification VIN code on the device panel and frame was roughly cut with a mechanical tool. The perpetrator did everything possible to transform the vehicle into a batch of flameless metal. But he underestimated the possibilities of current expertise. Laboratory technicians used the method of chemical etching. Carefully applying an acidic solution to the damaged metal piece, they renewed the crystal lattice of steel, ball by ball, which preserved the memory about the broken digits. After 4 years of cryptic work on the surface, the Primarni row of symbols appeared. Checking for the National Database of Data Vehicles gave a Mitavi result, which forced the detectives to look at a map of the state of Michigan under a new cut. The car belonged to a 28-year-old Jacob Reed. The name was well known to law enforcement officers in Gogabich County, but not in connection with the carjacking. Reed was listed in the databases as a helpful but problematic lawbreaker. On his account, there were arrests for poaching, trespassing on private property, and a series of thefts with malice in summer cottages. But the most important detail was his address. Jacob Reed was in the cricket town of Wakefield, just 15 miles from the Porcupine Mountains park boundary, where Catherine and Doris had disappeared 7 months earlier. On the 25th of June, 2215, a judge signed a warrant to search Reed's property. His land was an ideal place to hide any mystery. It interfered with the closed territory of the abandoned White Pine Mine, surrounded by dense forests and swamps, where the foot of the occasional tourist rarely set foot. The task force, which consisted of special forces and detectives, arrived on the spot before dawn. The assault began at about 6:30 minutes past midnight. The armored agents took out an old house, covered with vintage siding, and a large stolen barn that stood in the distance. It was quiet in the middle of the buildings. Jacob Reed was not seen on the spot, But what the police found confirmed the gruesome account of Catherine Thomas. The main attention of the group was focused on the barn. Under the hay and rusty agricultural tools, operatives found a masterfully disguised hatch in the floor. When an important wooden crate was lifted, the darkness was filled with an important odor of hotness, filth, and fear. It was that very cellar. A concrete mishk without windows, soundproofed with old mattresses and foamed plastic. The flames of the Lichtarist revealed the details of the Polonian women's subsistence, which made the blood run cold. In the closet was a mattress, on which the criminals would later find biological traces that would match Ketrin's DNA by 100%. There were 2 cheap plastic pet bowls with dried food on them. But the most damning evidence was the wall. On the gray concrete, at the height of a man's height, there were visible, deep, chaotic underprints. The experts conclude that they were filled with human nails at the moments of vidchayu. Everything in that dungeon screamed of violence, humiliation, and total control, as the ragged woman said. The investigation has received unequivocal evidence. Here, in this scorcher under the ground, kept Catherine Thomas. However, when the detectives rose from the basement and went to the residential building, the picture of evil began to grow, gaining surrealistic figures. On the first floor of the building, the typical bachelor's dwelling was in disarray. Dirty dishes, discarded clothes, empty beer cans. But when one of the detectives went up to the second floor and unlocked the door to the single bedroom, he froze on the doorstep, unable to believe his own eyes. The room looked as if it were occupied by an ordinary young couple. There were no grates on the windows or locks on the doors. There was a quietness on the bedside table near the bed, which had nothing to do with the atmosphere of the coil chamber in the barn. An attendant in gloves carefully lifted a comb from the table. A long, light hair was tangled in its tines. Visually, it was a perfect match for the hair of the deceased Doris Thomas. Next to the comb stood a stoneware mug of underdrinking cocoa, on the surface of which a film of mildew was already forming, and a pack of women's cigarettes. But the main sign, which forced the detectives to stop asking questions, was a glossy women's magazine, opened on an article about spring fashion. The date on the cover was clear and unrelenting. The loot of 2,255ths of the year. It meant that only a month ago, at the very time when Ketrin was rotting in a dark cellar and eating canned dog food, someone in this bedroom had been drinking hot cocoa, reading fresh press, and combing her hair. Someone who had complete freedom to move about the house. Someone who didn't try to get in and didn't leave marks on the walls. The contrast between the heat under the barn and this pastoral scene in the bedroom was so stark that the logic of the investigation began to rub at the seams. This room didn't look like a prison for the other victim. It looked like a residence for the mistress. Jacob Reed wasn't in the house. His pickup truck was gone, and Doris Thomas was lost in the early fog. The task force that had stormed the Wakefield orphanage found itself in front of an empty house that still kept its occupants warm, but could no longer give answers to questions about where they were. At about 1:30, 35 minutes past midnight, the plan for Rehopefulness was announced throughout the state of Michigan's and in the adjoining counties of Wisconsin. The oration of an old, rusty pickup truck and photos of the intruders, a bearded man in camouflage and a young woman thought dead just yesterday, went viral on all patrol posts. The police closed off the main highways, but the forest roads of the upper Pivostrov, which Reed knew like the back of his hand, remained an open corridor for traffic. Meanwhile, as the patrols scoured the roads, another, no less intense operation was underway at Detroit Police Headquarters. The Bibberslaughter Squad began an in-depth review of Doris Thomas's digital life. Investigators recovered her old laptop from the home of her father, Robert Thomas, hoping to find some kind of clues. The first look at the device created an image that perfectly matched the words of her parents. A modest, quiet girl, completely absorbed in her studies. The browser's history was filled with articles about botany, rare lichen species, and hiking routes. The social media were mostly empty, and the photographs were neutral. It was a digital portrait of an idealized girl. But experienced technical experts knew that each person has two sides of life, public and private. Using specialized software for digital forensics, they were able to recover fragments of deleted data from the hard disk cache. The real breakthrough came when the analysts gained access to a foggy vault, the password to which was buried in system files under the guise of a training document. There, in the digital shadow, investigators found what turned the case upside down. A secret account in a secure messenger, about the existence of which I did not know even the matter controller. Listuvanya I opened before the eyes of the detectives, nully chuchi thousands of messages, and began for 7 months before the disappearance of the women in the mountains. Doris's partner went by the name Ranger J. An analysis of the metadata and geolocation of logins to the system unmistakably indicated that Jacob Reed was using this pseudonym. But it was not the very presence of a secret lover that shocked, but the content of their conversations. It wasn't a romantic correspondence between two people who had died. It was a chronicle of hatred and a detailed plan of evil. The investigators read the dialogues, dated in the early 2000s, and they saw a very different image of Doris. Not a victim, but a strategist. In one of her letters, she wrote, "She's locked me in my room again. I can't breathe. I'm 25 and 4 years old, and I live like a prisoner of the military regime. She makes me take these pills that make me sick. I know I'm healthy, Jacob. She's making me sick for the rest of my life." These rows were the first direct confirmation of the suspicions of forensic psychologists that Catherine Thomas was probably suffering from delegalized Munchausen syndrome, a psychological disorder in which fathers repeatedly cause illnesses in their children in order to keep them dependent on themselves. But Doris's reaction to the violence was not one of lethargy. She craved pomposity. Ranger J's response was short and raspy. "We'll get you out of here, Mala, I promise. But we have to do it clean. So that no one will look for you. Not the copies, not your father." The dialogue, dated 2,214 years ago, a month before the trip to the park, was enough to destroy the version about the kidnapping. Doris wrote, "She won't just let me go. Even if I leave, she will find me. She must disappear. She must be taught a lesson. Let her see what it's like to be faithless. I want her to sit in the dark like I did my whole childhood. I want her to be happy, but no one feels her." The detectives who read these rows in the silence of the office felt a chill go down their spine. It wasn't a spontaneous decision. The trip to the Porcupine Mountains, the road of reconciliation, had been a deliberately planned trip. Doris Thomas, exhausted from years of hyperopics, psychological stress, and Primus treatment for undisclosed illnesses, decided to do more than just enter. She decided to change places with her jailer. With each reading of the message, the image of the unfortunate girl, who was being searched for by the entire state, fell to pieces. The portrait of a cold-blooded manipulator, who used the man buried in her as a tool for payment, was vimmalized. Now the police realized they are not looking for a victim who is forcefully kept by the maniac. They are looking for a malicious blowing, where the main violin is played by the one whom everyone thought to be a harmless lamb. And this blow was on the will, armored, dangerous, and ready to do anything not to return to the past life. Learning that Catherine Thomas was not just an accidental victim, but the murder of her own daughter, radically changed the course of the investigation. The police of the state of Michigan was no longer looking for a carefree female accomplice and her brutal Vikradachcha. Now it was a polyvant on two unsafe thieves who had nothing to lose. Photos of Jacob Reed and Doris Thomas were broadcast on every newscast, and state highway patrols were on high alert. But the forests of the Upper Pivestrov, which Reed knew as his own cache, gave the intruders a great advantage. A breakthrough in the search came only on the third day after the suspects were taken away. 2258th of January, 2055th of the year, close to 7:33 in the evening, the patrol team spotted an old, beaten with rust Chevrolet pickup truck, which matched the description of the car Rita. The car was parked near the Pine Valley gas station, located on a back road only a few miles from the Wisconsin state line. It was an ideal place for those trying to leave the jurisdiction of the local police. There were no forests, no security cameras, and a minimum of witnesses. Acting according to the instructions for the arrest of particularly dangerous criminals, the officers did not approach the pickup by themselves. They blocked the exit with a service vehicle and called for backup. The assault group arrived in 25 minutes. When the special agents, holding their weapons at the ready, entered the premises of the gas station, they saw a man who was calmly buying a block of cigarettes and kava. It was Jacob Reed. He looked disfigured, with bags under his eyes and 36 years of stubble. He had no support during the arrest. When the cadence clanked on his wrists, he only lowered his head tiredly. But the main question remained unanswered. Doris Thomas was not in the car or at the gas station. He was promptly taken to the nearest police station for refreshment. For the first 2 years he mumbled, staring at one point and refusing to answer the investigators' questions about the location of his accomplice. He was trying to play the role of a vigilant guard, taking all the blame on himself. But the detectives knew what they were looking for. When they showed him the transcripts of his own correspondence with Doris, where she coldly negotiated the details of the lesson for his mother, and informed him that he was in danger of being sentenced to imprisonment for theft, the armor of silence cracked. Exactly 3 years after he started drinking, Jacob Reed spoke. His testimony shocked investigators as much as the discovery in the trunk in Detroit. He did not try to justify his actions, but insisted on the fact that the real architect of this crime was Doris. According to the pre-doping protocol, Reed emotionally stated to the investigator, "You don't know who you're dealing with. You think Ketrin is the victim? Ketrin is a monster in human form. She's been drugging her daughter with powerful psychotropic drugs since she was a little girl. She faked her illnesses, from epilepsy to heart disease, just to keep her on her guard, to monitor her every move. Doris just wanted freedom. She was dying in that house. We were planning to go to Canada and get a fresh start." When the detective asked why they didn't move in right away, but decided to keep Catherine in the basement for 7 months, Reed lowered his eyes. His answer shed light on Doris's real motivation, which was much darker than a simple desire to leak. It was a pomsta, whipped up by years of belittling. Doris wanted her mother to feel the same way she had felt all these years, Reed said quietly, his words recorded by the security camera. This was her own trial. She wanted Ketrin to sit in darkness, in isolation, without the right to vote. Doris said it was only fair, an eye for an eye. But then we just ran out of money. We couldn't buy food and gasoline without paying attention. The road was slipping. She was angry not at the police, but at the fact that Ketrin would die there in the cellar of the cellar. She did not want to be a murderer. She wanted to be a judge. It was financial difficulties and fear of being accused of murder that forced them to change their plan. According to Reed, Doris had the idea to take Catherine to Detroit. She calculated that in the megapolis, an area notorious for its crime rate, the woman they found would be blamed on local gang violence or the actions of an accidental maniac. She forced Reed to make that last flight, hoping it would give them time to disappear for good. At the end of the drink, realizing that the game was over, Jacob Reed made a deal with the investigation. In exchange for a promise to take into account his cooperation in court, he named the place where Doris had been rehoused. She didn't dare cross the state line herself and waited for him at a cheap roadside motel, the Northwoods Inn, located about 30 miles from where Reed was detained. After receiving this information, the task force promptly went to the specified address. Night had fallen on the Michigan woods when a column of police cars without sirens, but with dimmed lights, turned onto the gravel road that led to the old motel. The detectives realized Doris Thomas wasn't the naughty girl they thought she was at first. She was a person who had spent 7 months cold-bloodedly watching her mother suffer, and no one knew what she was capable of now that she was cornered. The officers checked their weapons and prepared to storm the room number 7. On January 25, 2000, the operation to capture Doris Thomas entered its final phase. The Northwoods Inn Motel, located on the outskirts of a remote village near the state border, was surrounded by a ring of special agents. The building looked like a typical shelter for distant travelers and infiltrators. A peeling headlight on the facade, a fleeting neon sign, and a row of dark windows behind which other people's secrets were kept. According to information from Jacob Reed, Doris was in the family room. The police were preparing for the worst-case scenario, an assault or attempted suicide, because the girl who organized such a brutal kidnapping of her mother had something to lose. The assault began at exactly the second year of the night. The occupation group broke down the doors of the room with a battering ram, rushing into the middle with shields and armor at the ready. But instead of barricades or hysterics, they saw a surreal picture of absolute calm. Doris Thomas sat on an unmade bed in a room lighted only by the blaky glimmer of a television screen. She did not flinch at the thud of the broken door, nor did she raise her arms or try to get in. She simply turned her gaze from the evening show to the masked men in armor. Her appearance changed dramatically. The long, bright hair that had been described in the orations was gone. Now she had a short cotton haircut, and her hair was stuffed in a radical black color with cheap farbo, traces of which still remained on her skin near the fringes. She was wearing expensive new clothes, which contrasted with the squalor of the motel room. When the officer instructed her to lie down on the floor, she obeyed the command with regularity and geniality, as if it were part of a game. While the Cadens were on her back, she did not ask a single question about her mother, who was found alive in Detroit, or about her future. The only thing that interested her, she said in a dry, emotionless voice as they led her out to the patrol car. "Jacob gave me up?" That phrase was the first stroke in the true portrait of Doris Thomas that the investigators began to put together in the drinking room. A metamorphosis took place in the police station that startled even seasoned profilers. The quiet, beaten victim of the hyperopics, about whom the neighbors and relatives had told, disappeared. In front of the detectives sat a cold, impolite manipulator with a high intellect and complete absence of empathy. She remained confident, looking the investigators straight in the eye, and from the first few minutes, she took the initiative in the conversation. Doris took a line of defense, which was based on a complete discrediting of her mother. She stated that the whole incident was staged by Catherine Thomas herself. According to Doris, the mother, obsessed with attracting the attention of her boyfriend and the community, planned the disappearance to the finest detail and forced her daughter to coerce her under threat of physical abuse and forfeiture. "You don't know her," interjected Doris to the detectives in a plaintive tone. "She is a sickly woman who likes to play the theater, I was only a marionette in her show. I tried to get in, but Rid was on her side. They made it all up.
This story might seem plausible, given Ketron's confirmed diagnosis, were it not for the evidence that the investigation methodically laid on the table in front of the suspect. The first blow to her story was the DNA results. The detective laid a schematic of Ride's house in front of her. Catherine's biological traces were found exclusively in the basement, on the mattress, walls, and plastic bowls. Doris's traces, hair, parts of epithelium, fingerprints, were found only on the second floor, in the quiet bedroom, kitchen, and bathroom. Science clearly distinguished between the zones. One woman was a woman in waiting, and the other was a mistress. Another proof, which eroded the image of the tainted victim, was a video recording from the ATM surveillance camera in Ironwood. The recording was dated on the 22,000th day of January, 2494th year, the winter, when Catherine was freezing in an unheated basement. On the monitor's screen, Doris Thomas, dressed in a warm down jacket, was withdrawing a deposit from her mother's bank card. Standing next to her was Jacob Reed. The video clearly shows Doris returning to Reed after the transaction was completed, laughing at the roast and gently taking his hand. There was no fear or primus in her demeanor. She was a happy girl who enjoyed her life at the expense of the wife whom she had condemned to suffering. However, the final highlight of her defense was a personal notebook found during a search in her backpack in a motel room. It was a thick notebook, written out in slim, neat handwriting. Doris didn't just fictionalize events, she savored them. The notes were the chronicle of a sadistic experiment. The detective read out the corner of the Eurovec, dated the 142nd day of the execution, and a silence fell on the room, important for lead. Day 142. Today I went downstairs to give her water. She was crying and wondering why God had left her. She never realized that God had nothing to do with it. I'll decide when the sun comes up. I wonder if she still calls me for help when the light goes out. She thinks we suffer together. That thought makes me hungry for cocoa. I'm in charge now. Now she knows her place. When these words were spoken in the room, the mask of bemusement on Doris's face flickered for a moment, but not from the swing. It was a grimace of disappointment at the fact that her personal triumphalist thoughts had become a public nuisance. She realized that the diary was not just a proof, but a direct knowledge of the motive. She was not fighting her mother's tyranny. She simply wanted to take her throne and overpower her in cruelty. The investigators looked at her and realized. In front of them sat a person for whom the 7 months in the cellar were not a tragedy, but a long-lasting revenge. And she did not regret anything, except the fact that her labor was interrupted. On June 22,554th of the year, in the District Court of the State of Michigan, began the trial, which the press middily dubbed the Trial of the Brothers of Mid-Mountain. The case, which began as a story of a tragic disappearance in the wilderness, transformed into a national sensation, exposing the darkest parts of family relationships. The court building was packed with TV vans, and the hearings were broadcast live, attracting millions of viewers who tried to understand who the real monster in this story was. The defense of Doris Thomas used an aggressive and emotional strategy. The lawyers tried to convince the jury that before them on the bench sits not a cold-blooded victim, but a victim of a systemic domestic violence. The key moment of the defense was the presentation of medical records of the defendant, extracted from the archives of various clinics for the last 15 years. The document showed that Catherine Thomas had been treating her perfectly healthy daughter for years for undisclosed illnesses. forcing her to take highly toxic drugs, undergo painful procedures, and live in complete isolation. The term delegated Munchausen syndrome was used dozens of times in the courtroom, causing some of the jurors to be sensitive. The lawyer argued that Doris's actions were an act of defect, a desperate attempt to escape from the suffocating embrace of her mother, who was repeatedly beating her person. However, the prosecution had on their hands, which could not be overridden by the child's injuries. The state prosecutor based his promo on the facts that confirmed the high degree of severity and duration of the crime. In his final promo, he addressed the jury with rhetoric that eroded the image of the merciless girl. 7 months, the prosecutor said, carving each word, pointing to the calendar on the projector screen. This is not an affair. This is not a decade of panic. It's 210 days of cold-blooded, planned tortures. Every early afternoon, while the defendant slept with her husband on the mountain, listened to music and read journalism, her mother drank water from a dog bowl in a dark cellar. She had 210 chances to stop. 210 times she could have unlocked that hatch and called the police. But she didn't do it. These words became a turning point. On the 6th of August, 2015, the judge pronounced the sentence. Jacob Reed, who had made a full plea bargain and testified against his partner, received a 15-year sentence for participation in the theft and unlawful confinement. He hearkened to the Wyrok Mowczki without lowering his eyes. Doris Thomas's sentence was significantly more severe. The jury found her guilty of first-degree kidnapping of a person and infliction of grievous bodily harm. The court sentenced her to 25 years in federal prison. As the judge read the verdict, Doris's face did not crease in the slightest. She accepted her fate with the same piteous guardedness with which she had watched her mother's suffering for 7 months. The epilogue of this story did not bring relief to any of the participants of the drama. Catherine Thomas never recovered from the fever. Her physical wounds healed, but her psyche was permanently damaged. She did not return to her husband, could not live in the house that reminded her of the past. Now she lives as a female in a specialized home for young people, Sunny Meadows, under a vigadanimus name. The staff of the institution said that the woman was afraid of darkness. In her room, all the lamps are always lit, and the windows are closed so that every flicker of light for a month does not remind her of the darkness that comes from the forest. She does not talk to anyone, and for years she sits in her chair, staring at the door, as if waiting for it to open. Doris Thomas, while serving her sentence in a high-security penal colony, never once tried to contact her mother or father. She waived her right to appeal. In a single interview, which she agreed to give to a prison psychologist for a private study of the nature of domestic violence, she said that she would put a mark in this motorcycle case for any kind of punishment. When asked if she was sorry about the scone, Doris replied with a memorable chuckle. "Those 7 months were the best time of my life. For the first time in 25 or 4 years, I was full-breasted. I was healthy. And if the price of this freedom is to spend money on windows now, then I am ready to pay." The story of the disappearance in Porcupine Mountains Park has been preserved in the archives of the police as a reminder that the worst prison is not concrete walls or subdivisions in the woods. It's a family, tormented by bullshit and control, where the boundaries between love and hate are blurred, and the victim and the cat can change places at any moment, turning a quiet family evening into an atrocity that has been talked about for decades.